Thanks, Cathaoirleach. Every weekend, ministers, I meet families whose deadlines for eviction are in a few weeks' time, or at the end of the month, recently at the end of January, now at the end of February, then the end of March, April, May, and so on. Many of those families, of course, face an eviction, have children, often up to their late teens, and some mothers and fathers bring those children with them to my information clinics. It's very sad and appalling, Cathaoirleach, to see the distress in the faces of those children as they themselves face eviction from their homes. They face homelessness and grave uncertainty. Even simple tasks like storing food or getting to school or getting to work, of course, become a nightmare in homeless accommodation. In many of the cases I represent, landlords give the usual excuses of requiring a house or an apartment back for a relative or to live in themselves. But after the eviction, of course, the properties are often immediately let out again for €1,300 or €1,400 or even up to €1,500 or €1,600 a month, way above Dublin City Council and Fingal County Council's rent supplement rates. And of course, increasingly landlords are simply saying they want to maximise rent and that rent supplement rates are far too low. All this is happening, of course, Minister, after your 8 months in office and the Social Housing Strategy 2020. It's still just aspirational talk, task forces, meetings. Rent supplement accommodation has long dried up with rents in Dublin Bay North and probably in your constituency as well, Cathaoirleach, and other urban constituencies, as rents are soaring 30% above 2012 levels and back close to the Celtic Tiger levels. Daft, for example, .ie, the website, for quarter 3 of 2014 put rents for a 3-bed in Dublin 3 at €1,655 a month, in Dublin 5 at €1,418 a month, in Dublin 13 at €1,352 a month, and in Dublin 17 at €1,275 a month. And of course we have 20,000 families and citizens seeking accommodation on your watch, Minister, in this city, 89,000 nationally, with 359 homeless families now, and 780 children this very day seeking accommodation, for which you are personally responsible, and Minister Alan Kelly. It was always, of course, grossly unfair of Minister Burton to use rent supplement limits as a crude and totally useless form of rent regulation. In PQs to me today, Minister Kelly says he's monitoring the rental market very closely, and also refers to the Private Residential Tenancies Board Do You Know campaign, which sounds, where tenants, if they're getting anxious when they feel that rent increases in excess of the market rent, are supposed to contact the PRTB. But for what? This is totally feeble and useless responses by you, Minister, and your senior minister. Senator Aideen Hayden last week held a very informative briefing on what you call the third generation model of rent regulation and on how rent regulation works in Europe, offering security of tenure to tenants and landlords, where rent and increases or decreases are fair and usually linked to the consumer price index. Clearly, from that briefing, I learned that the report of the Constitution Review Group of 1996, the report of the Commission on the Private Rented Residential Sector of 2000, the All-Party Oireachtas Committee on the Constitution, the 9th report of 2004, and the DKM Economic Consultants Rent Stability in Private Rented Sector 2014 report, which you have in your desk, Minister, they all agree that the form of rent control sanctioned by the Rent Restriction Acts of 1946 to 67 was unconstitutional, but that fair and proportional rent control is not unconstitutional. And I understand that the Residential Tenancies Act is intended to be amended, and we clearly need to have now some form of serious rent regulation being inserted into that Act. And of course, for myself, I've no problem in amending the Constitution so that the rights of property would be amended to ensure that the kind of savage rents being imposed on very vulnerable families in this city and our other cities tonight would not be acceptable and would not be allowed to happen. And finally, of course, Cathaoirleach, in countries such as Germany, France, Belgium, Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, most of our EU partners, rental prices are linked to the cost of living. All have reasonably healthy rental markets. It's clear, however, that the greedy madness which enveloped Dublin rental markets in the mid-noughties and is again threatening our society wouldn't be tolerated in almost any of our EU partners. So I'm asking you to ask Minister Kelly or the two of you to sit down together, Minister, and start coming forward with serious regulation of rents in this country.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach.
Minister, you've 4 minutes.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Fundamentally, Deputy, the main cause of rising rents is a lack of supply in the market. And, you mentioned the Social Housing Strategy 2020, which was published last November. And it's not just a strategy. It sets out clear, measurable actions and targets to increase the supply of social housing, reform delivery arrangements and meet the housing needs of all households on the housing list. In addition, Deputy, the implementation of the range of actions under the Government's Construction 2020 strategy will support increased supply in the wider housing market, and indeed we will be expecting local authorities to come forward with proposals in the coming weeks to seriously ramp up the provision of social housing in every constituency in this country. The private rented sector is an important element of the housing market, with the proportion of households in the sector almost doubling in the period from 2006 to 2011. And I am very conscious of the difficulties caused by rising rents. In the third quarter of 2014, rents were 5.6% higher nationally than in the same quarter of 2013, according to the most recent rent index from the Private Residential Tenancies Board. Rents for houses were 4.3% higher, while apartments rents were 7.3% higher than in the same quarter of 2013. In Dublin, which is seeing the highest rates of increase nationally, overall rents were higher by 9.5%, although the rate of annual increase was down slightly. Deputy, the Government is monitoring the rental market closely and is considering all options in relation to achieving greater rent certainty, which is in the interests of tenants. The options put forward in the report Rent Stability in the Private Rented Sector, commissioned by the PRTB and published in autumn 2014, form part of these considerations. My overriding objective in relation to rents is to achieve stability and sustainability in the market for the benefit of tenants, landlords and society as a whole. In this regard, we need to be cognizant of the possible negative impacts of rent regulation, including in relation to the impact on supply and the potential for black market transactions. The Residential Tenancies Act 2004 regulates the landlord-tenant relationship in the private rented sector and sets out the rights and the obligations of landlords and tenants in relation to security of tenure, the termination of tenancies and the rent and rent reviews. The ongoing development of a stable, well-regulated rented sector is a key goal for this Government. The legal framework set out in the 2004 Act represented the most significant legislative reform in the private rented sector in over a century. Prior to this, there was little or no security of tenure for tenants, and in most tenancies the landlord had a virtual absolute right to raise the rent at any time. And that's not the case, Deputy, at the present time. The 2004 Act provides clearly that rents may not be greater than the open market rate and may only be reviewed upward or downward once a year. So unless there has been a substantial change in the nature of the accommodation that warrants a review. The Act also provides that a tenant must be given 28 days' notice of a new rent. These provisions have effect notwithstanding any provision to the contrary in a lease or a tenancy agreement. And Deputy, I'd like to reiterate that where people are under the pressure of eviction, that they do have rights under law with regard to their tenancies. And the PRTB are undertaking a national campaign to ensure that tenants are aware of their rights and that they don't leave a house prematurely or at the whim of a landlord. And you know, we are taking this issue very seriously, and I do thank you for raising it all today.
Deputy Thomas Broughan.
Obviously, Minister, the lack of supply, of housing supply, is the key problem. And the output of your first 6 months in office, the total output, I think, for 2014 was 11,000 housing units, and you're talking maybe about 15,000 housing units for 2015. Not even half good enough. Now, you now have 300 million with Deputy Kelly that you got from the EIB, I think, and from the government, and you've established this working group, I think, with the 9 major voluntary housing agencies around the country and with the local authorities. And we want now no more talks. Let's have some action, a little more action, please, ministers, because nothing is happening in this area. It's like we talk, endless meetings. In Dublin Bay North, my area, which represents about a quarter of Dublin City, we've seen nothing so far in the North Fringe, maybe 10 or 20 houses, 40 apartments coming forward for an area which alone, by the way, has 5,000 people on the housing list, 5,000 families. That's the nub of the problem. I wanted to ask you, by the way, last week Governor Honohan, he published the new mortgage rules. Did you and your department have any input into those rules? Because many observers felt that one of the net effects will be to price many young families out of buying their own home in urban areas, and so further increase the demand for rental property. And of course, nearly up to 40% of homes in the Dublin area are now rented. But the nub the problem again, Minister. The Dublin Region Homeless Executive, I think, said on the 25th of January last, there were 359 families with dependent children and 780 children in total in emergency accommodation. And the hallmark of your administration, and indeed Deputy Kelly's, Deputy Kelly always seems to be very interested in his legacy, what legacy he's going to hand on. His legacy at the moment is that during his period as Minister for the Environment, one family became homeless in this city every day. He created one homeless family every single day.
Thank you,
that's the legacy. So the final point I want to ask you again, Minister, it seems clear in the constitutional advice, the advice of lawyers, that a well-attended briefing recently of Senator Hayden, that there is no constitutional impediment to us bringing in serious, real rent regulation, not the timid efforts of Fianna Fáil in 2004, but real serious rent regulation to give us a modern rented sector like many of our European colleagues, like the German cities. And we want action now, Minister, no more talk.
Thank you, Minister, to conclude.
Thank you, Lasca Hirlock, and with due respect to the Deputy, this is the first social housing strategy in a generation, and I would commend Government and indeed Minister Kelly for the work they have done in ring-fencing significant funds and a significant commitment by Government to address the social housing deficit that's in this country. And I think you should at least give some acknowledgement to those efforts that are being made. And to say on the floor of the House that nothing is being done is very far from the truth, Deputy, because quite an amount is being done. The strategy has been put in place. The funding has been provided. The Government has reiterated their commitment, and now, Deputy, we are engaged. We are engaged now, Deputy, with local authorities, approved housing bodies, and every other stakeholder that can contribute to offering solutions to what is a huge social housing deficit in this country. And we will deliver on that, because the next phase of that delivery and implementation is about to be rolled out over the coming weeks. And you will see, Deputy, in your own constituency and many other constituencies, the start of this delivery. This year alone, the social housing strategy will provide over 7,000 new social housing units, and a further 8,500 units will be secured under the HAP scheme. So the total housing provision will result in an investment of almost €800 million across a range of housing programmes this year. So there is a lot of action, in fact, Deputy, and I think you should acknowledge that. It's also the case, Deputy, and I've mentioned this earlier, that a recent PRTB poll found that only 64% of tenants are aware of their rights under the 2004 Tenancy Act. And having regard to these findings, the PRTB, as I said, is developing a national communication strategy to ensure that tenants are aware of their rights, that they're not being removed from their homes, as you say, at the whim of a landlord. And we will monitor this situation very closely with regard to rent, and we will take action where we feel it appropriate. Thank you.
That concludes topical issue.